We begin with breaking news. China has announced tariffs on U.S. imports, including crude oil, coal, and other goods, to come into effect next Monday. The levies are in response to Washington imposing tariffs on all Chinese imports. Trump says the tariffs are punishment for Beijing's failure to stop fentanyl smuggling into the U.S. China says the drug is America's problem but has left the door open for negotiations. The White House says there are plans for talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping later in the week. Let's get more on this from DW correspondent James Cheta in Taipei. James, what more do we know about these tariffs that Beijing has just imposed?
Well, they came so quickly after that deadline imposed by Donald Trump of when those US tariffs were going to be imposed on Chinese imports, really across a very broad range of areas. You mentioned there tariffs of 10% on oil and agricultural products, some 15% levies on coal and liquefied natural gas, but also looking to target other areas of the US, opening a probe into antitrust practices with Google, and also putting some US companies on what China calls an unreliable entities list. Now, this is a list that China often can apply to foreign companies that imposes restrictions on their interactions with China, imposes in some cases restrictions on the amount US companies can invest in China. So really a very quick response from Beijing to those tariffs coming into force from Trump. But again, as you mentioned, this February 10th deadline in some ways could be seen as a bit of a breathing room. There could be more discussions before that deadline. We have heard that Trump is likely to speak with Chinese leaders in the coming days at least. So an opportunity perhaps for a reprieve before those Chinese retaliatory measures come into force against the US.
But in the interim, the US tariffs have gone into effect. What impact will they have on China?
Well, it's really important to remember with these particular tariffs that these US measures targeted towards China are coming on top of tariffs that already existed against Chinese imports. That said, of course, there will be a direct impact because of this 10% levy. It will be hitting Chinese exporters hard, of course. Exports, of course, a really central part of driving economic growth in China. But there will also be an acceleration and a broader questioning, I think, of countries which are looking to diversify their supply chains outside of China, something that really has been in progress over the past couple of years, really instigated by that initial trade war that was started by Donald Trump during his first administration. So we could see an acceleration of that process too. Of course, in those intervening years, China has been trying to insulate its economy as far as possible from shocks like this. It's been trying to invest heavily in domestic industry, in advanced technology. So the economies of both these countries are in very different positions from that first trade war. China, of course, some might argue is in a more difficult economic situation right now, but they have been taking measures to try and insulate themselves from these types of measures. So the full impact really remains to be seen, and it will play out over the next couple of weeks.
Despite this potential trade war deepening, is there a sense that China could ultimately benefit from what is going on?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because before these retaliatory measures came out from Beijing, there was this discussion about how muted China's response had been to Trump's warnings that new tariffs were going to come into force. Some were suggesting that was because China was in the middle of a Lunar New Year holiday. But there has been some discussion about whether there is a more strategic aim here. And because, of course, Trump is, his approach has really been targeting so many countries that have historically been viewed as key partners of the United States. Of course, Canada, Mexico, but also further afield, Colombia, and of course, Panama being a really good example where the threat of China was cited as cause for these more kind of draconian measures targeted towards a country. In all of these situations, China has kept a relatively muted response, has remained relatively calm, and there has been some discussion about whether this is a concerted effort on the Chinese to in some way present themselves as the adult in the room when it comes to international relations now, drawing a stark comparison with the approach that Donald Trump is clearly taking now, targeting measures on key US allies and really sowing division between those allies too.
We'll leave it there for the moment. DW East Asia correspondent James Chater speaking to me from Taipei. Thanks so much.